point. It was a month after Donald Trump had just been elected president. Quote, "Americans are no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, communism. Our one advantage is that we might learn from their experience. Now is a good time to do so. Here are 20 lessons from the 20th century adapted to the circumstances of today." That was a Facebook post from a month after Trump was elected. It basically broke the internet at the time. By popular demand, it soon turned into this survivor's guide of a book that very likely you or someone you know or a lot of people you know have a dog-eared copy of. Or maybe that you've been carrying around in your bag for a couple of years, if you're like me. It is called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. It's a very short book. It fits in your pocket. It is filled with sobering and very specific advice for being a citizen in a country that is at risk. Being a citizen in a country where democratic norms and the basics of our system of government suddenly don't seem like a given anymore. It's not an activist's guide, per se. It's a survivor's guide. The New York Times advised approaching it like a medical pamphlet on an infectious disease. Quote, "Read it carefully and be on the lookout for symptoms." Let me show you a little bit what they mean. Case in point, lesson number 2, defend institutions. It is institutions that help us to preserve decency. They need our help as well. They fall one after the other unless each is defended from the beginning. So choose an institution you care about, a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side. This is from lesson 14. Establish a private life. Nastier rulers will use what they know about you to push you around. Scrub your computer of malware on a regular basis. Have personal exchanges in person. For the same reason, resolve any legal trouble. Tyrants seek the hook on which to hang you. Try not to have hooks. I'll give you one more. It's from lesson 5, and this one has been stuck into me all this week like a splinter under a fingernail. You will see why when I tell you what it is. Lesson 5 is, remember professional ethics. When political leaders set a negative example, professional commitments to just practice become more important. It's hard to subvert a rule of law state without lawyers, or to hold show trials without judges. Authoritarians need obedient civil servants. Concentration camp directors seek businessmen interested in cheap labor. Like I said, stark, right? But it is not drawn up from nowhere. It's specifically drawn up from an expert's history of other countries no dumber and no wiser than ours, that nevertheless lost their democracies at some point in the 20th century. Yale history professor Timothy Snyder speaks 5 and reads 10 different European languages. He has studied Russia and Ukraine for a quarter century. And our country now is starting the process of impeaching the President of the United States because of him trying to enlist the government of Ukraine against his political enemies to help his re-election next year. Also, apparently, to muddy the waters about Russia helping him win the last election. Because of that, I asked Professor Snyder if he wouldn't mind coming here to the studio tonight to help give us some help with this. Joining us now is Tim Snyder, best-selling author of On Tyranny and another bestseller which is called The Road to Unfreedom. He's a professor of history at Yale University. Professor Snyder, thank you for being here.
Very glad.
Let me just ask you, as a historian, as somebody who has done a lot in terms of public education, as a public intellectual, to talk to people about Russia, talk to Americans about Russia, talk to us about freedom, in the context of what happened in our election. How are you feeling this week?
I'm feeling like people are understanding something which we needed to understand from the beginning, namely that we're all in this together. A lot of the ways that our democracy is going sour happened already in Russia, and a lot of the things that the Russians are doing to us involve just kind of jollying us along. So when we think, for example, of Mr. Trump saying, well, yeah, of course interfering with elections is okay, everybody does it, that's exactly the line which Russia is trying to push. There aren't facts, there's not law, there's not justice. Everything's really a joke. Only power matters. What we're seeing today is how this all fits together. It's not just that Russia helped Mr. Trump to get elected, it's that a certain Russian way of doing politics has spread pretty widely.
Is the idea that there's no reason for Russia to be held to account for bad behavior because there is no such thing as good behavior? There is no moral leadership in the world or moral expectation in terms of how countries should behave. And the U.S., as the world's policeman, We were obviously a number one target for them on that, but that's basically the way that they've tried to sell their international standing for a generation now.
But logically, it makes no sense. I mean, either things are good or they're not good. If it's bad to invade countries illegally, it's bad to invade countries illegally, whether it's Iraq or whether it's Ukraine. What you can't say, unless you're a kid on a playground, is, well, because he did it, it's okay for me to do it. Either there are principles or there aren't principles. If there are principles, then you have to stand by them and hold everyone to the same standards.
With President Trump and his personal lawyer, Mr. Giuliani, apparently trying to enlist Ukraine in a number of different efforts. We've been talking about it in the context of the impeachment inquiry, which is specifically about trying to either engineer or dig up something that will hurt Joe Biden, that'll hurt the president's potential political opponent in 2020. Beyond that, though, and it hasn't been the focus of the impeachment inquiry, but beyond that, it seems like they've also been looking for a couple of other things. They've been looking for law enforcement action against the accusers of Paul Manafort, the people who brought forward evidence of Manafort's corrupt behavior in Ukraine that ended up getting him kicked off the president's campaign in 2016, that ultimately led to him going to jail where he sits today. They're trying to undo the prosecution of Paul Manafort. They're also trying to undo the initial attribution of the 2016 attack to Russia. They want to make it seem like maybe Russia didn't attack us. Why is all of this happening through Ukraine?
I'm glad you asked that question, because I want to start just by reminding us all that Ukraine is a real country and Ukraine has real problems. For example, Ukraine was invaded by Russia. Russia annexed Ukrainian territory, the first time a European state has done that to another since the Second World War. Ukraine has taken 12 or 13,000 mortal casualties in this war, which proportionally is about as much as Vietnam for us. It's five 9/11s, again proportional to population, and the Russian war in Ukraine was just as unexpected. This is a country with 2 million internal refugees. But this is a place which has held democratic elections, the last one and this one, free and fair. They have big problems, and what they need from us is to encourage them to follow the rule of law. The tragic thing, as you say, about what's happening now is that we're doing the opposite. Every aspect of what Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Trump are doing is pushing them in the wrong direction. At the obvious level, they're urging the president of the country to be corrupt. Then they're saying, your old prosecutor general, who everybody agreed was the most corrupt person in the country, he was good, should be brought back. And then they're saying, your investigative journalists, who are the good guys in this story, for Ukraine and for Russia and for us, those people are enemies, I'm now quoting. They're calling them enemies of the United States, enemies of America. They're talking about the people who actually find out the things we need to know about inequality, corruption, and war. And that for me is just awful.
The thing that is, I think, as somebody who knows Ukraine, to be able to get that level of detail in terms of how this is affecting them and what this is going to do to them on their own rights and vis-a-vis what they've got to handle in terms of Russia and this ongoing war, it's fascinating. When I think about Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani, I do not think of them as guys who are experts on the internal machinations of any other country or even our own. And so the idea that they are over there basically tuning up all the good guys and helping out tuning up all the good guys and helping out all the bad guys. Yeah. It's hard for me to know why there and what it is about Ukraine that has become their playground in this way.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a couple of things going on here. First, they correctly have the instinct that Ukraine and Russia and America are all part of one story. It's just they have it wrong. How? The way it all played out was that as Russia was invading Ukraine in 2014, it was trying out the hybrid war strategies, the cyber war strategies that it then used in 2016 against us. In that sense, it is all one story, and the personal connection of Paul Manafort, who is the advisor of both the Ukrainian president and the American president-to-be, is just the exclamation point at the end of all of that. So they're right that it's all connected, but they're totally wrong about how. What they're saying is, by the way, the same thing that the Russians are saying, or many Russians are saying. For example, a Russian senator said it today. What they're saying is that, well, actually the whole thing was Ukraine helping the Democrats, not Russia helping the Republicans and Mr. Trump. And they're trying to build up this sort of counter-narrative, which they can use as a boomerang to push the other one back. There are a lot of problems with this, but the most obvious one is that it's just not true. I mean, they have an instinct. They can sniff out who the worst people are. Like, they're very good at that, but they don't have their facts straight about what actually happened, and so they don't have any basis on which to build.
Because you have written a sort of survival book, a sort of symptom diagnosis manual in terms of losing your democracy and what tyranny and authoritarianism look like up close when you're living through a country that might be sliding in that direction. I have to ask, now that we are in an impeachment crisis, now that we are about to impeach the president because of his contact with Ukraine, asking Ukraine to get involved in our election on his behalf, what you think we should be looking for as citizens and what you think would be a strong way for us as a country and as a democracy to handle this. What are you worried about? What are you hopeful about?
Well, I think we have to take a step back and ask how Trump was possible in the first place, because as awful as the things he is doing are, and really I think asking for foreign interference in 2 different presidential elections is a record that's unlikely ever to be broken.
Yeah.
As awful as that is, we have to ask, what was it about us in 2016? Our electoral system, our inequality, what is it that the way we deal with the internet, our lack of local journalism, what is it that allowed this to happen in the first place? And can we then fix that? So regardless of which party we like, this kind of thing doesn't ever happen again. As far as how we've done in the medium term, I think the journalists we have left have done an excellent job. The terrifying thing is to imagine, what if this had happened in 5 years or 10 years when we had no real journalists left? Because that's the trend. Everything we know in the world is coming from a handful of investigative journalists whose work is then, denied or repeated or plagiarized or fictionalized. But we only have a few of them left, right? I mean, they're the heroes of this story now, and they're the heroes in Russia, and they're also the heroes in Ukraine. And then the other thing is that this is fundamentally all about the rule of law. Do we believe in the rule of law? The rule of law comes before democracy. It comes before everything else. Is this man above the law or not? Or are we all subject to the rule of law? That's what's fundamentally the stakes right now.
As the House pursues impeachment, is there a way to do that in a way that is maximally bolstering of the rule of law in a long-standing way?
I think there is. I think it's important to enunciate what the principles of what we're doing are all the time. I realize that for narrow political reasons, it makes sense to focus on this Ukraine issue because basically the president confessed to it.
Caught,
right?
And then admitted it and then proved that he did it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like if you confess in the back of the squad car, that means you're innocent. It's not actually how it works. But I understand the temptation of that because basically the whistleblower report tells you everything you need to do. But I do think it's important to remember that this is in a larger context, not just of Russia, but of a whole series of things which show scorn for the idea of law. I mean, the story which just broke today, telling the Russians that it's okay to interfere in our elections, that's just a very large example of this notion that there isn't really law, it's just a joke. You do it, we do it, everybody does it, and therefore it's okay. If that's your idea, then you're going to have oligarchy and authoritarianism. You have to have some notion of principle, even though it's impossible to attain it perfectly. You've got to have it.
Timothy Snyder, best-selling author of On Tyranny and the Road to Unfreedom. Thank you so much for coming to the studio and being willing to talk to me tonight.
It's
I really
a real
appreciate
pleasure.
having you here.
Thank
Thanks.
you.